Forget everything Hollywood ever told you about knights, because in the roar of real battle, their swords didn't sparkle, their armor wasn't clean, and every strike was a brutal conversation between life and death. They stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a gray, unfeeling sky, the smell of iron and sweat heavy in the air. The year might have been 1415, or 1314, or any century between, for the chaos of war never changed its language. Picture it, a field choked with mud, horses stamping nervously, banners snapping in the cold wind. At the center of it all were the knights, not shimmering heroes from a movie, but hardened men wrapped in steel shells, trained from birth to fight, bleed, and kill. When the horns sounded, they didn't charge in perfect slow motion, swords raised high to the heavens. They moved with method, with fear, with calculation. A knight was less a lone warrior and more a piece of a living, grinding machine of destruction. Most people imagine a knight holding a sword like a baseball bat slashing wildly, sparks flying with each swing. In truth, a knight's sword was a tool of precision. Its edge could cut, yes, but more often it was used to thrust, to find the gaps in armor, to puncture rather than slice. The technique was called half-swording, gripping the blade itself halfway up, turning the weapon into a steel spear. The movies never show that. They show grand duels, not the brutal intimacy of real combat, where a knight's gloved hands wrapped around a sharp blade to guide it through a gap in a visor, under an arm, or through the thin mail protecting the groin. Armor, too, was not the heavy prison Hollywood loves to show. A well-fitted suit of plate armor, crafted by a skilled smith, weighed about 45 to 60 pounds, roughly the same as a firefighter's gear. Knights could run, roll, climb onto horses, even fight for hours. They trained relentlessly for it. A knight in full harness could do push-ups, somersaults, and mount his steed without assistance. The myth of clumsy metal men toppling over if they fell. Utter nonsense, born from centuries of romantic exaggeration. In the true Middle Ages, agility meant survival, and those who weren't agile didn't last long enough to tell stories. And the sword, the sword was not always the weapon of choice. The mace, the poleaxe, the warhammer, these were the true nightmares of the battlefield. Against plate armor, a sword's edge could glance off like rain on stone, but a hammer blow, that could cave in a helmet, crush ribs through steel, or knock a man unconscious inside his armor. The poleaxe, often standing as tall as its wielder, was the medieval multi-tool, an axe on one side, a hammer or spike on the other, and a long hooked shaft to drag opponents down from horseback. When two knights clashed with poleaxes, the fight wasn't graceful. It was like two blacksmiths trying to destroy each other's anvil. Sparks, screams, and sheer force. Battles themselves weren't cinematic duels under blue skies, they were sensory overload. The ground trembled with hundreds of hooves, the sky filled with the whine of arrows. Once melee began, visibility dropped to near zero. Helmets limited vision. The air filled with dirt, blood mist, and the stench of death. Imagine fighting in that chaos, hearing your own breath echo inside your helmet as you swing blindly, praying your blade finds flesh before someone's poleaxe finds your neck. Adrenaline and terror mixed into something raw and electric. There were no choreographed moves, no elegant spins. A knight fought with economy, each movement meant to kill or survive. And yet, there was training behind every movement. From the age of 7, a noble boy would become a page, learning discipline, horsemanship, and the handling of weapons. By 14, he was a squire, practicing real combat drills, learning to clean armor, sharpen blades, and ride into mock battles. Only after proving himself in combat or service could he be dubbed a knight, not by lineage alone, but through sweat, bruises, and often blood. The ritual of knighthood was a reward for endurance, not mere birthright. It wasn't just about learning how to swing a sword, it was about learning when not to, because knights were professionals, not berserk. They understood tactics. They fought as units. Shields overlapped, formations locked tight, cavalry coordinated with infantry. Orders were shouted through horn signals and banners. The most effective knights were not lone wolves, but parts of disciplined, deadly machines. When cavalry charged, it wasn't a reckless dash into glory, it was a timed assault, designed to break the enemy's morale, to exploit weakness, to punch a hole through enemy lines so the infantry could follow. The movies liked to show one-on-one duels, but most real combat wasn't glamorous. Knights didn't chase personal glory mid-battle. They fought to win, they aimed for advantage, attacking from behind, striking a fallen enemy before he could rise, finishing the wounded. There was no mercy on the battlefield. Capture was sometimes better than death, especially if the opponent was wealthy enough to ransom. A high-ranking knight might even surrender if surrounded, knowing that his family's gold could buy his freedom. But even that had its brutality. The honor of knights didn't always extend to the enemy. Burning villages, executing prisoners, or massacring civilians were not uncommon, especially in wars driven by religion or revenge. The chivalric code, the one full of noble vows, protecting the weak, serving the just, was an ideal, not a daily reality. On the field, survival came first. Still, knights had to live with what they did. In the silence after battle, when the screams faded and the crows began to gather, many would kneel in exhaustion. armor dented and slick with blood that wasn't always their own. They prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness. That's the part the movies never show, the quiet guilt that haunted even the strongest. When you strip away the legends, you find the truth. Being a knight wasn't about shining steel and heroic speeches. It was about mastering fear, enduring pain, and turning violence into a craft. Each battle tested, not just muscle, but will. A knight's greatest weapon wasn't his sword, it was his ability to stay calm while everything around him burned. And that's where the real story begins, not in the myths told by poets, but in the grim, muddy fields where men in steel fought to redefine what it meant to survive. Training was the forge where knights were made, and discipline was the anvil. Long before they ever set foot on a real battlefield, young squires were shaped through years of merciless preparation. The process was as much mental as physical. A boy of noble birth would be sent away at a young age, usually to the household of a seasoned knight or lord. There, he'd begin a life of relentless conditioning. He rose before dawn to tend to his master's armor, horses, and weapons, learning through sweat and service what it meant to live by steel. Every day was a lesson in endurance. He'd run carrying stones in his hands, spar with wooden swords until his arms went numb, and practice mounting and dismounting horses in full gear until muscle memory took over thought. Each bruise was a lesson, each scar a certificate of progress. But what truly defined a knight wasn't strength, it was precision. Unlike the chaotic swashbuckling of movie fights, real combat demanded control. Squires trained in structured drills under masters at arms, learning a codified system of strikes, guards, and counters. Manuals known as fechtbook or fight books began appearing across Europe, especially in the German and Italian schools of combat. These illustrated guides detailed everything from sword techniques to wrestling holds, poleaxe maneuvers, and armored grappling known as harnischfechten. It wasn't about swinging wildly, it was about exploiting angles, controlling distance, and dominating balance. A knight was part athlete, part tactician, and part predator. They learned to fight on horseback and on foot, in open field and in tight castle corridors. Mounted combat was an art of its own. The lance was the centerpiece of this discipline, a long, sturdy spear designed for devastating charges. At tournaments, the lance was used for sport, in carefully arranged jousts that displayed skill in control. But in war, it was a missile of flesh and steel, capable of piercing through armor or knocking an enemy from his saddle with bone-breaking force. Yet even this weapon required teamwork. A single knight charging alone was suicide. But a formation of lances, leveled shoulder to shoulder, could hit with the kinetic power of a moving fortress. Cavalry tactics evolved constantly. The ideal medieval charge wasn't just a mad dash, it was a coordinated, rhythmic assault. Horses, armored and trained, not to flinch at blood or sound, moved as one with their riders. The sound of dozens of destriers pounding the ground at full gallop was like thunder. Dust clouds rose, banners streamed, and the very earth seemed to quake. To face that, to stand in the path of that demanded inhuman courage, and yet, discipline could beat courage. Infantry armed with long pikes or sharpened stakes could stop even the mightiest cavalry if they held formation. The Battle of Courtrai, in 1302, proved that. A Flemish militia, made up mostly of commoners, slaughtered French knights by standing firm with their pikes and defending the muddy terrain. The age of cavalry dominance began to crack. That crack widened as ranged weapons evolved. The longbow, the silent killer of knights, changed warfare forever. At battles like Crécy and Agincourt, English longbowmen unleashed storms of arrows that pierced the sky like black rain. A trained archer could shoot 6 to 10 arrows per minute, and a single volley from thousands could darken daylight itself. The armor that once made knights invincible now became their prison. Punctured, heavy, and exhausting, it trapped them when they fell. At Agincourt, thousands of French knights, bogged down in mud and armor, became helpless targets. They weren't defeated by superior swordsmanship, they were undone by evolution. Knights adapted, of course. They always did. They thickened their armor, changed designs, improved metal. Helmets became more aerodynamic. Breastplates gained fluting to deflect arrows and blows. The art of the armorer reached near perfection in the 15th century. Gothic and Milanese plate designs transformed knights into walking sculptures, beautiful and deadly. But with every innovation came a counter. Crossbows fired bolts with tremendous force and required little training compared to longbows. Gunpowder began whispering its way across Europe, reshaping the sound of war. The thunder of hooves would soon be replaced by the thunder of cannon. But before that transformation was complete, knights still ruled the land, and their way of fighting reached its zenith. Imagine a 15th century turn-in field in Burgundy or France. Knights in gleaming harnesses face off in ritual combat. The crowd roars as they clash, poleaxes slamming, shields splintering. These weren't mere games, they were rehearsals for war, where skill and honor intertwined. Beneath the chivalric veneer was the same brutal science of battle, leverage, timing, and endurance. A knight could fight for minutes or seconds depending on his stamina. A single mistake meant broken bones or death. In real war, those same techniques took on a different tone. Sieges became the proving grounds of knightly endurance. Imagine climbing a scaling ladder under a hail of arrows in boiling pitch, one hand gripping a shield, the other a sword, while molten oil hisses against your armor. Or, defending a breach in a wall, striking down wave after wave of attackers while the ground shakes from battering rams below. Every stone castle was both a home and a war machine. Its design reflected the mindset of the knights who built it, a balance of beauty, symbolism, and lethality. Towers were raised for archers. Murder holes were placed for boiling oil or stones. Narrow staircases forced attackers to fight upward, always giving defenders the advantage. Knights were not merely warriors. They were engineers, logisticians, and leaders. They learned to command men, manage supplies, and navigate political webs that were as dangerous as any battlefield. A knight without strategy was just another corpse in a ditch. The strongest survived not only by the sword but by wit. Many of the greatest knights were also scholars of warfare. They studied terrain, understood morale, and adapted their formations based on enemy weapons. When facing archers, they used shields and formations. When facing cavalry, they anchored themselves behind terrain. War was never static, and neither were its masters. But the movies rarely show that complexity. They show gallant duels, not logistics, yet logistics won wars. The knight who could feed his men, rally his troops, and time his strikes would crush even a stronger foe. Every march, every meal, every night spent sharpening blades or tending horses was part of the same art. Knights understood that war was not won by glory, but by persistence. Still, for all their discipline and pragmatism, knights were human. Fear lived in every heart. When the sky filled with arrows, when cannon fire shattered walls, when friends fell beside them. They weren't heroes, they were men trying to survive. In the chaos of battle, training became instinct. A knight would forget everything except the rhythm of combat, swing, step, thrust, block, breathe. It was a deadly dance, honed over decades. And yet, beneath the steel and blood, the code of chivalry endured, or at least its ghost did. It gave knights something to believe in. Protect the weak, honor your word, serve your lord faithfully. These weren't just ideals, they were armor for the soul. Even as the real world grew darker and more cynical, knights clung to that dream. In the moments between battles, they wrote poetry, prayed to saints, and pledged themselves to causes that gave meaning to the madness. But war had no mercy for dreams. The rise of organized armies, mercenaries, and gunpowder weapons began to erode the need for armored elites. Still, knights fought on, refusing to fade quietly. They took part in crusades, civil wars, and rebellions, adapting to each new threat. Their weapons became symbols more than tools. The sword, once their badge of skill, became the mark of their order. The age of the sword was dying, but the spirit behind it, courage, discipline, and mastery, lived on. And that's the paradox of knighthood. The more advanced the world became, the less space there was for the men who defined its wars. Their way of fighting, born in the chaos of the Dark Ages, reached its pinnacle just as the dawn of modern warfare began. The thunder of the cannon was already echoing on the horizon. The battlefield was changing, and so too, with the knight. The age of the knight didn't end with a battle. It ended with a sound, the deep, echoing roar of gunpowder. What swords and lances had done for centuries, cannon and musket would now do with terrifying efficiency. The battlefield was changing faster than chivalry could adapt. Once, armor was a symbol of invincibility. Now, it became a liability. A single lead ball could pierce through plate where no arrow ever could. It didn't matter how noble a man was, how many years he'd trained, or how pure his code. The musket didn't care. It democratized death. A peasant could now kill a noble with a weapon he barely knew how to use. The age of personal heroism of the lone armored champion was fading like mist at dawn. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. In the early 15th century, knights still rode proudly, banners fluttering, blades shining in the sun. They believed themselves untouchable, the pinnacle of human warfare. But then came the bombards, massive cannons that could turn stone fortresses into rubble. Sieges that once lasted months ended in days. At Castellon, in 1453, the last battle of the 100 Years' War, French artillery obliterated the English knights before they could even charge. It was a grim prophecy of what was to come. By the time the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with twisted armor, relics of an age that had no place in this new world. The Renaissance dawned, and with it came invention, science, and the cold logic of organized armies. Warfare became less about courage and more about coordination. Pike formations, musketeers, and artillery lines replaced the chaos of individual combat. Knights found themselves leading men rather than fighting among them. The armor that once made them gods on the battlefield now marked them as anachronisms. Many clung to their identity, polishing their armor, joining tournaments, and serving kings who still valued the image of knighthood even if they no longer needed its practicality. And yet, even in decline, knights refused to vanish quietly. Across Europe, they transformed. In Spain, they rode into the New World, carrying their banners and faith across oceans. In France, they evolved into the cavalrymen of royal armies. In England, their descendants became lords and statesmen. The spirit of knighthood shifted from steel to symbol, from battlefield to honor, from armor to ideology. The code remained, even as the tools changed. Honor, duty, courage, those words outlived the clang of sword on shield. But not all knights adapted. Some resisted. In the German lands, during the Peasants' War of 1525, the old feudal knights fought desperately to preserve their dying order. They believed themselves chosen defenders of a divine hierarchy, but their castles fell to cannon fire and revolt. In that struggle, the last echoes of medieval knighthood burned away. Those who survived traded swords for politics. The feudal knight gave way to the courtier, the diplomat, the noble officer. The battlefield no longer needed armored champions. It needed commanders who understood formations, supply lines, and the math of war. Still, humanity couldn't let go of the image of the knight. The world that replaced them was colder, more mechanical. The knight, though obsolete, represented something that transcended technology, an ideal of courage, discipline, and sacrifice. Poets and painters resurrected them in myth. Writers turned them into symbols of purity and lost glory. Even centuries later, when the cannons of Napoleon thundered across Europe, soldiers still decorated themselves with medals shaped like crosses and stars, the last vestiges of knightly orders. The word sir itself, once the title of a warrior, lived on as a mark of honor. By the 17th century, armor was mostly ceremonial. Ornate suits of plate, gilded and etched with gold, filled the halls of palaces instead of the fields of war. They became symbols of status, reminders of a time when nobility was earned by valor, not birth. Yet even as their purpose faded, something deeper survived, the discipline that knighthood had taught. Modern military academies, with their emphasis on honor, loyalty, and leadership, were built upon that foundation. Every soldier who swears an oath to serve, to protect the weak, to fight with courage, to uphold duty carries a spark of that ancient code. And so, the legacy of knighthood became immortal not through weapons, but through values. The sword that once cut through flesh now cuts through time, a symbol of human aspiration. It represents the eternal struggle to balance power with morality, courage with mercy. That balance was what made the knight more than a killer. It made him a mirror of humanity itself. Think of the image, a man in shining armor, alone on a battlefield, facing overwhelming odds. He knows he may die, but he stands anyway. That image speaks to something primal in us. It's why, even today, the idea of the modern knight endures. From firefighters rushing into burning buildings, to soldiers holding the line, to everyday people standing up for what's right, the armor may have changed, but the spirit remains the same. And that's what history rarely tells you. The end of knights wasn't a tragedy, it was a transformation. The battlefield may have changed, but the code lived on, reborn in every generation that values courage over comfort, duty over fear, and integrity over gain. When we watch movies today, we still crave that image, the hero with honor in his heart, standing firm when all seems lost. We still call people knights in spirit, because deep down, we remember what they represented. They remind us that even in a world of chaos and cruelty, discipline and virtue can endure. That's why the myths survive. That's why we still tell their stories. And perhaps, somewhere, that's what every knight wanted: not to live forever, but to be remembered. Their bones may rest beneath ruined castles and forgotten fields, but their ideals are woven into the fabric of civilization. Every act of courage, every moment of loyalty, every quiet choice to do what is right when no one is watching. That's the true armor of the modern age. So when you picture a knight, don't imagine a man in shining steel, imagine the reflection of your own strength when tested. Imagine the fire that refuses to die, even when the world moves on. Because that is what they fought for, not glory, not conquest, but meaning. And if you want to keep exploring these hidden truths of history, the real stories behind the myths, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Join us as we uncover the past, not as Hollywood shows it, but as it truly was, raw, human, and unforgettable.